Hello and welcome to the Integrated Rehab and Performance Podcast. My name is Dr. Nick Curtis and I'm running the show here at the Integrated Rehab and Performance Center. Today we have a golf-centered podcast. We are talking about the glute bridge with leg extension test, TPI's test here. And what we're looking at is how important is the glute, or how important is glute activation at the right time, or control over the pelvis. How important is that to the golf swing? And it turns out it's quite important. So today we're going to talk about that test. We're going to talk about how we use the glutes to control the pelvis and the hips in the golf swing. And then why is that important for the golf swing, different swing characteristics, and then how we test it, right? So that leg extension test. And then addressing that test. So if we find a golfer is limited in this capacity, how do we go about addressing that, right? And of course, we have it kind of broken down into different stages, and then we'll finish off with a kind of a little wrap up. But that is the agenda for today's podcast, and of course, comes with some videos in between. So be on the lookout for that. So let's get started here. So first and foremost, how do we use the glute muscles in the golf swing? What is their role? What do they do? Why are they important? Well, to remind you, the glute max muscles, they attach from the back of the sacrum and the pelvis, and they connect to the back and outside part of the femur. So what would happen here is if we were to contract the glute on a stable pelvis and say the leg was floating, it would rotate that femur bone outwards. We call external rotation. It would also extend that femur, so it would pull that leg backwards. Now, if we were to stabilize the femur and have an open chain or access to move the pelvis a little bit, and we kind of emphasize pelvis movement, say we planted our foot in the ground, kind of like we do in a golf swing, then we have a closed chain in terms of the femur, and what we can do maybe now is control the pelvis with that same muscle. So if we do that same muscle action with a closed chain, it could pull that pelvis backwards into posterior tilt, and it could also rotate that pelvis away from whatever glute muscle is being contracted. So it would pull the back side of that pelvis towards that same side femur and rotate that pelvis technically away from that side. Now that is really important to understand. And now we can see with the glute, it's all about controlling the pelvis. So if we control the pelvis, it also plays a role in core stability, right? And core, again, stability there, mostly important in controlling the pelvis. You can imagine a anterior tilt or a posterior tilt. We talk a lot about this and TPI tests for it a lot. We've done articles and podcasts on that before, so check those out if you're unfamiliar with like an anterior pelvic tilt and the importance there. But again, the glute muscle plays a role in that golf posture position as well as through dynamic motion there of the golf swing. So again, characteristics that include the pelvis and that involve the pelvis, like sway, slide, early extension, loss of posture and hiking, many others, all those in some fashion, they are affected by or the use or the lack of use of our glute muscles in the appropriate way. So very important that we know how to test and see if you are in control of your glutes, if you know they exist, if you know how to turn them on, and then we can go about seeing like, can you actually use them in the swing? And if not, we have different ways of trying to transfer that usage or understanding of how to use the glute to control the pelvis into the actual golf swing. But let's take a closer look at why controlling the pelvis is so important for the golf swing, and we're going to talk more specifically about early extension and their role in avoiding early extension here.
Okay, what is early extension in the golf swing? Technically, early extension, if we draw our lines, is a line from the top or the back of the pelvis, from address to the top of the backswing. Now from here, we expect as we come down into that follow through, that our back hip takes up that space as we follow through into that swing, and we don't create any space between where the line started and then where we are here. So we don't want to see any space opening up through there. Oftentimes what happens is we draw that line through there, is that as we come up through the backswing, as our right hip does a good job of staying in that space, but as we come down, we early extend and we lose space between our pelvis and that back and that downswing, right? So what happens is this left hip doesn't rotate around it to take up that space as we swing through here like this, but instead we extend forward and out. So some things that we need to think about pelvis and the mechanics there at the pelvis is we can start thinking about what muscles are used to control the pelvis. We have the core, but we also have the glutes, and that's what usually gets forgot about in the golf swing. So what we need is for the glutes and the core to help control this anterior and posterior tilt of the pelvis. So think forward and backward kind of dumping of that pelvis. But we also need it to control this rotation. With this left foot being in a closed chain position, which means it's contact in the ground. If I contract this glute, this foot is kind of won't move, right? So instead of moving the foot and the femur, what this glute can do is it moves the pelvis, right? So we can either move the pelvis open up, or we can use the other glute to do the opposite, to move the pelvis this way. Okay, so what that looks like in the golf swing, what we need to reintroduce to the golfer is the ability to use this hip not only to control this posterior and anterior orientation here of the pelvis, this forward and backwards, but also the rotation at the pelvis, so that we can use it after we draw our early extension line, that we can use it to contract this left glute. So on the downswing, we're pulling this pelvis back and towards us here. Right? So what that does is it allows us to keep that space like we've been asked to do so. It helps keep this pelvis back, and it produces force that we can drive through in that front leg without leaking or moving or shifting forward, but instead keeps us back and powerful. Okay, so what we need to do is reintroduce that glute to do that role in the golf swing.
Okay, now that we have a better understanding there, how do we test for this? Well, the test that we are talking about here today is the Brentwood leg extension test. So what this is simply is the golfer lays on their back. They will get into a bridge position where they are extending their hips towards the ceiling, pushing their hips towards the ceiling with flat feet, and then they're going to lift one foot and extend that knee, so they're really using only one leg to hold them in that bridge position. And we're going to see, does their hip start to wobble after 10 seconds? Does it drop down on one side relative to the other when we touch the other side? Does the hamstring cramp, or does the low back start to hurt or cramp? That tells us these golfers do not want to use their glute to do the role of hip extension and pelvis and control that pelvis. Instead, they'd rather use other muscles like the low back, very common, and the hamstring, very common. So if those muscles start to cramp or being overutilized, or you have any pain, this tells us we need to work on that with this golfer before we go about transferring or looking at the swing and trying to get the pelvis to do the right thing in the swing. First, we need to make sure we can even use the glute at all, right? So that's where we're starting kind of phase one with people that cannot hold that position for 10 seconds without one of those things showing up. So let's take a closer look here at the TPI Brentwood leg extension test.
For the single leg hip bridge, what we're going to do is lay on your back. I want the camera low to the ground here. Again, it's a side angle. What I have you do is with both legs bridge up, and what I want to see is that the tibia is coming straight up vertical to the ground when we're in our bridge position. So I'll just let you at home check that by bridging up a couple times, trying to get these shin angles to be perfectly vertical. That looks pretty good to me. So you can come back down and relax. So for this drill, we're going to have you bridge up, and then we're going to lift one leg off the ground, keeping both thighs parallel, right? So what that looks like is, Nick, if you bridge, I want you to extend your left leg. And what you'll see is that both thighs stay parallel. He's not bringing this leg up. We're letting it go way down towards the ground like that, right? So relax for a second. What we'll do is both sides. I want you to be able to hold this for 10 seconds. If you start to cramp in the hamstrings or the low back, if you could just let me know through the camera, that'd be great. Okay? So what I have you do is bridge up. If you have a partner or someone helping you, you can go ahead and bridge up. We're going to put a dowel, broom, or a golf club across your hips. I want to know, this is going to help tell me if one of those hips starts to dive, okay? So Nick, one leg straight. And now we'll start the timer. We'll try to go for 10 seconds. I'm watching in the camera. You can relax there. So Nick started to cramp. Is it the hamstring? Good. So if you cramp, you just let me know. Let's try the same thing on the other side. That was a quick cramp. Bridging up. Good. I want to get those hips a little higher towards the ceiling there. Good. And so in the video, just making sure everything's in line. We're trying to hold this for 10 seconds. He's working hard. The dowel is telling me that one hip's starting to dip. So it's all really good, important information to know.
So if that's the case and you're a golfer and you're unable to kind of complete that test without having some sort of issue pop up, then we need to address some things, right? So where is a great place to start? Well, how about a kind of a bridge, more of a hip extension. But in this version that we are doing this, it's almost like, think about turning the lights on, turning them off. can we just utilize the glute to move through a little bit of range of motion of hip extension and pelvic tilt, right? So that's what this first exercise is all about. Can we get this stuff to start to turn on a little bit? I need you to feel this exercise purely in the glute. We put you in a position that makes it a little bit easier to do so, and we're only moving in glute, kind of peak glute activation territory, where we're getting as much mind-brain connection there, mind-muscle connection to the glute, and really getting that honed in before we move on to the next one. So let's check out these two exercises. The second one being a kickstand hinge. A little bit more going on there. It can be technical. To do it right, truly, it is kind of technical, and a lot of things have to go correctly. But it's a great exercise for getting a good activation of the posterior lower glute and really learning what it feels like to let that glute stretch and open, and then use that stretch to contract and slowly close that back down. A great exercise to create mobility in the hip, create extensibility in the tissue around the hip, and then also learn how to use that glute muscle. So let's watch these two videos here.
All right, here we're doing a glute bridge, but we're doing a very specific version of it. We want to focus on that end hip extension, right? So our end range hip extension. So we get into kind of a typical glute bridge position through here. We're going to bring our hips up high. And then from here, what I want you to think about is keeping your rib cage stacked over your pelvis. All right. So what I don't want to see is this, where our pelvis is tilted forward. I don't necessarily want to see this super tucked under position here either. Just think right in the middle there. And then this position maintains throughout the movement here. Okay? So this is actually the starting position for our glute bridge here. From here, I want you to think only using your glutes to get that little extra couple inches towards the top here, right? So I'm stacked from here. Focus on the glutes, pushing to the end range. Then from here, the only thing you relax, again, is those glutes. You drop down. We stay stacked through here, not dropping down into this. We're staying stacked. Put my feet out a little bit further. Just the glutes. All right, drop down again. Slowly up. And back down. Right? So you're just contracting the glutes, holding here for a couple seconds at the top, controlling the way down, making sure to stop right before you start tilting at the pelvis. It's really just as far down as when you let go of your glutes, is that this is the only range of motion that the glutes are kind of participating in for this version of it. So from here, back up. All right, good. So it should only be a couple inches. Go ahead, give that a shot.
All right, for our kickstand hinge, this is a very important exercise for us. What we're going to do is we're focusing on opening up and expanding the posterior hip and glute here. It's fantastic. We're starting to create some motion, some space in the back of this hip. Really important for things like low back pain, pelvis pain, knee pain, foot pain, anything up and down the chain that's connected to that posterior hip and hip capsule. So for this, we're going to be standing in a hinge position here like this. One foot is kind of kickstand back. Most of our weight is on this front foot here, say 90 to 95% of our weight. Now, from here, I want you to think about getting as long as you can from your tailbone to the top of your head through here like this. The key here is to maintain that length without going into this hyperextension through here, but we also don't want to slouch. So try to find that spot right in the middle, and then think about getting tall, right? So not extending, but just as tall as you can from here to here, and maintaining that as we hinge. So I'm going to use my left hand here as a kind of a reference that I'm pushing my hip back, and then I'm feeling a stretch on the right glute. So if I do that with my left leg here, pushing this hip back, feeling this expand as we come straight down. Again, staying as long and tall as you can as you do that, and then coming back up. Now, a really important part of this is that we have a slight bend in our forward knee. So we want it almost over our toes, maybe somewhere between our ankle and our toes. And again, staying as tall as you can here, staying out of extension. Thinking about my hips go backwards as my head goes forward. So my hips are going backwards and almost up is a good way to think of it. That your tailbone or your sits bones here go up as your head goes forward.
and we're feeling a big stretch through the glute inside of the hip here. And then we use that stretch to slowly come out of that hinge. Again, our knee stays bent as we do that. And you want to feel that outside of the hip and that posterior hip working hard to create that motion for us. All right, so go ahead and give that a shot.
Next, now we really want to emphasize a later stage. We really learned how to turn on that glute and control things, control movement with that glute, especially with that kickstand hinge. We're controlling the motion of the pelvis, and eccentrically and concentrically. But now we want to do it more in golf-specific positions where we're getting into hips and out of hips and using speed a little bit involved and external load to do it. So let's look at 2 exercises that we can use to take this thing to the next level. One being the front side-to-side kettlebell swing, where we're shifting into one hip and then the other, and then one hip, then the other, but we're not letting ourselves run away with it. We're not letting the hips go crazy with this. We're controlling it. We're certainly using the hips and the lateral hip and the back and the glute to shift from side to side, but we're also using the glute to slow down on one side and then use that build up to then push out of that side. So a great exercise for that. And then the med ball shovel pass, again, a great way to teach the hip, the glute, to start to push us away from one pelvis and rotate that pelvis towards the other side. So let's take a good look at these 2 exercises. A great kind of way to cap off the glute progressions here when we are emphasizing and building up towards a golf-specific glute work or workup treatment plan you can think of.
Okay, for the side kettlebell swing, what we're doing here is a variation of the kettlebell swing where we're keeping the kettlebell in front of us, and now we're moving in the side to side frontal plane here. Okay, so what I want us to think about doing is keeping your feet in line with each other. What we're going to do is bring the kettlebell back, shoot it through. So what that looks like is bring it back, shooting up and through. Here you'll notice what's happening at my knees is if I try to keep both feet flat on the ground and keep that kinetic chain closed, we're going to get a lot of motioning or relative motion trying to happen here at the hips. Is exactly what we want in some cases. So what we're really using is getting a ton of hip activity, right? In this case, it would be internal rotation on this right side as I come through, and then internal rotation as I come through onto this side. What I can do is use that stretch or that pull from here, and then use that to push out of that side. Same thing here, stretch, opening, moving into internal rotation here, and then pushing through. Again, if we try to keep our feet flat and keep our heels from coming off the ground, we're going to really influence how much motion is coming from the hips through here. You see the knees are bending a little bit, internal rotation, pushing out of it. And you can do that in both directions. Focus on feeling the stretch, throwing it through, feeling the stretch, throwing it through, and then you can start increasing the weight and load on this. And again, you should feel that weight shift happening from side to side, something that we miss a lot in our everyday life or even training. So we're missing this weight shift from side to side and training it and feeling it. So go ahead and give that a shot. Okay, this is our medicine ball shovel pass. Few key things with this exercise and drill is, first of all, the motion is going to be from here and through. What I want you to think about when we're doing this is not to let your hips just follow through weakly like that, but instead I want you to think about avoiding something like an early extension where these hips shoot forward, and instead I want you to think this lead side hip, in this case my left hip, I want you to think of it as shooting back as we come through, so that this hip is behind my lead heel, right? So instead of coming through like this, I want you to think of driving this hip back. You can almost see as if my foot would come and slide back, but the friction is going to keep it there. So instead my hip comes back like that as we shoot and explosively throw that ball through. Again, avoiding this weak hip moving forward, but driving through, getting that hip back and keeping that hip back. Give it a shot.
Okay, so this is some great exercises. To conclude here, we outlined a simple kind of description of how we can take findings from that bridge with leg extension test and start it from kind of a ground up, turning on those glutes, getting what it feels like to use those glutes, starting to build a little bit of strength into those glutes, and then going from there to emphasizing core and glute control, pelvis control with the glute, and then a little bit more explosive, more dynamic, more force, more external force to use those hips to control the pelvis as we rotate from side to side, and then create force with them and absorb force with them without letting things go haywire, still controlling that pelvis. Okay. So great things to try. Take it out of the course afterwards and see if you can try to feel those glutes working, keeping those hips back and staying out of that early extended position. And then we can take a look at that swing, see what else maybe needs some work, and how your body is related to the swing characteristics that you're finding, and how we can go about working on the body and then trying to transfer that over to the course for you. There are some other articles that are very similar to what the concept here, the lower quarter rotation test, and then what is sway in the golf swing. So a article where we talked about specifically about the swing characteristic sway, check that out. And then the lower quarter rotation test, again, check that out. I'll put the links in the description here. And there's much more, especially in the early podcast episodes. But check out the blog articles and titles and see if there's any that interest you there. The early podcast episodes, see how you can kind of build onto the next podcast that has some relatable information on this one. Okay. Otherwise, feel free to reach out via email, text, through the website. You can find a way to contact me right there, and I'll be happy to answer your questions or get you in for a free discovery visit or discovery call and see what we might be able to do for you. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.